Siege. So, good morning, Geoff Bickerton. Good morning, Ken Lookart. Geoff is, I believe, in Ottawa.
I am
And
outside of Ottawa.
good. And then Ken is in Toronto, and I'm Doug Miller here in Montreal. It's Wednesday, the 21st of July, and we're interviewing Geoff about his experiences in his union with respect.
Let's make it Thursday, Doug.
Pardon?
Let's make it Thursday.
Okay, Thursday's better. Yeah, I got Wednesday on this little thing that my dad left me. Thursday, the 21st of July. And so we're going to interview Geoff Bickerton about his experiences with the union, CUPW, Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and the anti-apartheid movement and SAC2 solidarity. So Geoff, good morning again, and welcome to these interviews. I know you sent us back the consent form, but we need to put an oral affirmation of what you just read or did sign through in the consent form. So you've read it, you understand and agree to the conditions therein?
I do.
Good, excellent. So Geoff, we all have a life before SAC2 and before the union. How did you, where are you out of, and how did you get exposed to social justice issues like apartheid and then the union eventually and SAC2 solidarity? Could you just take us on a little bit of a path there?
Oh, gee. Well, when I was, when I was in high school, I was the only kid I knew that was subscribing to Moscow News. I don't know exactly how I got there. My stepfather helped organize his union in the late 1940s, and my experience with him was one where the union was extremely important. Being in a union and having the security. He was a warehouse worker. He worked on the night shift, operating a stacker, and so I guess that got me into more left-wing thinking, and I got involved in the Ottawa Committee for Labour Action, the Ontario WAFO actually before that, and after it had left the NDP, and then the Ottawa Committee for Labour Action, which sort of was the Ottawa remnants of the WAFO after the WAFO sort of disintegrated, and was involved in the labor movement. I worked as a laborer, as a member of CUPW, and was involved in the Labor Council and in the left in general. And a job came up at the CUPW. I'd finished my university. I went part-time to university. I'd finished it, and the John Deverell, who was the director of education at CUPW, who was leaving, they changed the position to a research position, but he suggested I should apply. I did, because I thought it would be an opportunity to talk to Joe Davidson and Jean-Claude Perrault one-on-one, and they were my heroes, them and Madeleine Perrault. And so I ended up getting a job. I'm totally unqualified for it, but whatever. And that got me involved in CUPW. And at the time, like most young people, as throughout my life, I'd been deeply against the Vietnam War, and grew up in that culture of understanding the world from the viewpoint of looking at American imperialism. But I didn't know much about the world. I had spent a couple of years hitchhiking in the Middle East and North Africa and Europe, and so that had sort of opened my eyes to a lot of things, around like poverty, and especially in the Middle East, around hitchhiking in the occupied territories, about the situation of the Palestinians. But I didn't know anything about South Africa, except that I would follow whatever currents in the left were calling for us to do. So I didn't know really much until I met up with these people from the SACTU Solidarity Committee. And I think that goes for many of the people in our union. You know, the union had a policy against apartheid, but every union had a policy against apartheid, and everyone on the left was against apartheid, but we didn't really understand the dynamics and what was going on in South Africa, or basically what sort of role Canadians could play at that time. And so it was the individuals from the SACTU Solidarity Committee, when they approached the union, all of a sudden the lights went on. And frankly, I can say this, I know Ken's listening, but it was the obvious integrity and the political analysis that they shared with us, that I think really made the difference in terms of getting CUPW much more involved in South African, specifically SACTU Solidarity work than it would have been otherwise.
Wow. So just to put a little time frame to this, you finished university about when, and you joined CUPW when, and you were to the Middle East when?
Started CUPW in January of 1977, finished my university at about, let's say, in about 1974, hitchhiked a year in 1970 and a year in 1972. So, and worked in decent unionized jobs, laboring jobs, etc. Between 74 and 77.
Wow, a very dynamic time in history as well, full of lots of things going on.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. So do you remember your first meeting with SACTU Solidarity?
Wow, I've been trying to think of that. I actually don't. I remember it was through a phone call that, and I'm not sure if it was Ken Trainer, Ken Lukehart that set it up, and that they were coming to Ottawa for a reason, and so we met, and they basically described the SACTU, what it was, what they were doing, what they needed to sort of move forward in a way in terms of getting support from some of the affiliated unions. And I think they were, even at the very, very beginning, pretty forthcoming about the overall situation in terms of trying to understand the sort of tensions that existed around the CLC and around, there's, I think they made that sort of pretty clear at the beginning that we had, the CLC was supportive of the anti-apartheid struggle, but everything at that time seemed to be happening through the lens of anti-communism, and there was a lot of red baiting in the labor movement, etc. A lot of people were sort of unwilling to step out on issues for fear of being labeled Reds, etc. There's quite a bit of that in the late 70s. And
well, CUPW, and I remember the mid 70s when they were leading some major strikes against liberal government policies and tactics with respect to unions. And the CUPW of the public sector was certainly one of the most militant. What do you figure was behind that kind of openness to militancy and for that matter, left-wing politics that included, in this case, anti-apartheid and SACTU?
Well, I think it really, you have to sort of go back quite a ways there. Like in 1965, the postal workers went on strike, and it was sort of like a wildcat strike. There was no legal framework at the time. And basically, following that strike at the convention, the union changed its name and really changed its orientation. And what had been going on at that time was Bill Walsh had been heavily involved with the leadership of the labor movement. They asked him to come in and help write the Constitution for the union.
Now, who's
And
Bill Walsh?
Bill Walsh was he was really respected trade unionist, but if not a member of the Communist Party, close to the Communist Party. In other words, you know, the union sort of started off from not really, maybe not even understanding the whole issue around sort of the Reds versus the others, but it received a lot of support from left-wing unions, and that goes right through. There was a wild a 2-week illegal strike in 1974. Within the membership of the CUPW, there was a lot of activists that were involved in left-wing organizations, not so much the Communist Party actually, but a lot of Trotskyist organizations and Maoist organizations in Quebec especially. So there was, and the CPL was pretty active in Toronto. I don't know what you'd call them. They weren't Trotskyites, but or Maoists, but they were very strong. Our local president for a while was a person from the CPL. And so there's a lot of factions, a lot of left-wing factions that sort of fought against red baiting within the union. I remember we submitted a resolution on red baiting in the late 70s to the CLC convention, and in the 80s. Eventually it was passed in the early 80s, with all the red baiters completely denying that they spent their life red baiting. But you know, it's so there was an openness, if you will, and we really saw that in the 1978 strike, where we went on strike. The government passed legislation, and basically Dennis McDermott at the time put out a statement asking unions not to comment because they were sort of working to support us, but actually, of course, they were working to oppose us. And they ended up at the last day of the strike. There was a meeting with Jean-Claude where McDermott announced that they were actually going to go and issue a statement calling for our members to go back to work, which we have a copy of. It was a press release that they had. So, but who was there to support us? It was the left-wing unions. You know, it was the fishermen. It was the left of the IWA, people like Jean-Marie Bedard in Ontario. It was the Mine Mill. It was, you know, it was UE. These were the unions that, you know, who stood up and supported us through that, and then supported us after the strike when we were really being attacked by McDermott. And so, you know, there's so we worked together and formed a sort of a loose alliance called the Action Caucus with them and some of the progressives from who are non-communist, but progressives from other unions, like Steve Taylor, who was president of Local 1005 and Steelworkers in Hamilton, and Dave Patterson. So we had, you know, alliances with various unions and worked together. So there was a bit of a context of the sort of a sense of the non-anti-communist left, that because it wasn't a communist left so much as it was communist and fellow travelers. And we worked with people like them and people like people who were actually part of the apparatus of the Communist Party that worked in the labor movement. So there was a sense of that.
Well, that's a tremendous insight to it, because I was always impressed with the militancy of the CUPW workers, especially as public workers, because they don't tend to be people who speak out all that much.
Yeah.
Ken, what would you add about that first meeting with
Yeah,
CUPW?
thanks, Doug. Just as a point of information, let's say CUPW rather than CUPW.
Ah, CUPW. Okay.
That's important for reasons that we won't need to talk about today. But yeah, I'm going to start, Geoff. First of all, like all the interviewees, it's great to see you again, and it's great to renew relationships. I want to start with a contextual comment and question, then I'll get back to some of the specifics as we go ahead. As I look back on our work in the 80s, the odds were against us, totally against us, for a number of reasons. First of all, we were introducing into the labor movement a new topic. I mean, nobody was really serious about anti-apartheid work in 1980. Nobody talked about South Africa. The media covered it from the point of view of the white minority, the business community, the military production. Oh, it was all supportive of apartheid. And that included the labor movement. So when I came back, when Brenda and I came back from Africa and Britain in 1980, it was a new subject matter. And to ask unions, no matter how progressive, to take on a new topic, a new struggle was a big task. So that worked, that we had to deal with that. Secondly, as Geoff has mentioned, the context was the Cold War, the height of the Cold War. Anytime people tried to make change, which side are you on came up. And so we had to deal with that. And that was commemorated, that was crystallized in terms of the CLC, the International Affairs Department, ICFTU, International Trade Union Politics. But nonetheless, despite those things, we moved ahead. And I want to jump then to a question that I'll put to Geoff. When we closed our doors in the late 80s, I remember Geoff talking to Ken Trainer and myself, suggesting that we should take the time then to document the methodology and the success of the SACTU Solidarity Committee as something that should be on record. Now, at that time, we didn't do that. The situation was too close to us, I think. We had to let time pass. But here we are 30 years later doing exactly what you suggested then, Geoff. And this has been an amazing experience for all of us. Jane, Brenda, Ken, everybody involved, Vince Greason, and Doug. So my first question, Geoff, is why do you think it's important that this effort that we made on behalf of South African workers be documented? What's its importance for future workers, future movements?
Great question, Ken, and it's important for a number of reasons. And firstly, as you mentioned, the labor movement on its own gets consumed with the issues of that its members are facing, usually at the workplace, and on its own, it can't solve those problems. And it takes a degree of thinking things out to realize at some stage that the problems are, you're going to spend your life sort of bandaging the wounds, etc. But you're not going to stop the major contradictions in our society that stop working people in their tracks, and it has to do, as you know, with who has power in society, etc. So so on its own, I think the labor movement sort of spins its wheels. And when I say that, I don't mean to depreciate the incredible work and courage of the people doing that. But it takes sometimes people to intervene, if you will, to shake things up and to get people thinking out of the box about what's possible and how we really change the world. And it was clear at that time, it wasn't clear to us, although it became clearer to us, thanks to the work of yourself and others, that there was an opportunity to actually bring real change to South Africa. And I remember us having the discussion about the fact that the transformation of South Africa could lead to incredible changes in the world. And it was seen that way at the time, that it was conceivable because of the left leadership of the opposition in South Africa, that and the wealth of the country. I think we underestimated a number of things, like the difficulties and the of moving things forward post-revolution or whatever in South Africa. But it was seen by us that this could create a historic opening. Why is it important to document, though, the work that you did? Was because it was so systematic and so thought out and so strategic. And I'll tell you, this is, we just got a really good new elected person on our executive, the CUPW, who is strategic, who does think things out, etc. And, if there are not a lot of people like that leading unions, because that's not what necessarily gets you elected as a leader in a union. And so you need to have that, and individuals can't do that. It has to be a collective. It has to be a group of people. There's no one single person that can sort of figure it out. And you guys addressed the issue from so many perspectives with not just such clarity, but totally non-judgmental, understanding the situation that you are in, understanding sort of like the steps to organizing, if you will, understanding the opposition, and in a way that is really rare in the labor movement. Half the time we don't understand. We don't take the time to understand our opposition. For instance, we don't respect their strengths and their weaknesses. But any discussion that we ever had around how to deal with the CLC or other unions or issues within CUPW, there was always a sense of understanding the different layers of complexity. Now, that has to do somewhat with the individuals. I mean, you're a pretty exceptional crowd, let's face it. And then when you add them all together, I don't know, but there's some arithmetic term about how that ends up being a lot more than the sum of its whole. Anyway, so that was true. And people could see that. People like Jean-Claude could absolutely understand that right from the beginning, is that he was dealing with serious people who were not going to, end up taking us down some opportunistic road or whatever, but were seriously concerned with building. So that was the other thing. And it was, I'll say one more thing. You were willing to take calculated risks to move things forward, understanding that taking actions and getting people to actually act moves things forward much more than developing analysis. And what I mean by that is some of the and having a sense of that there are small actions and more risky actions. So like bringing a resolution to a meeting to have a local, pay a monthly donation to a strike fund that's half a world away. It's not that risky, but nevertheless, it notches things up a bit. It moves things a bit forward in terms of establishing a different base in that local that you can then work from. If you've got some sort of credibility and legitimacy, etc., to build from, as opposed to having an international day of action against apartheid, where I don't know, maybe there's 4 or 5 unions involved. I forget exactly. But we managed to get the Letter Carriers Union of Canada involved. That was really something. Yeah. It was that type of action that may involve risk, people in plants or whatever, getting suspended, etc. That's a different type of action. But nevertheless, it really does give people a sense that there is something happening here, that this is real, and that we're sort of actors on the great stage in this. as minor as those things might seem today or whatever, they involve asking people to do things that would take a little bit of a risk, like a suspension, etc. And I think we had a few suspensions in the general plan, but whatever. People knew what they were getting into.
Doug, can I follow up with?
Please.
Well, thank you, Geoff. That's really important. And 30 years later, it's okay to do it now instead of before. We're doing it. That's the important thing. I don't have my 1980 calendar in front of me, so I can't remember when we first met, but I will say that the two unions that got us off the ground were the CAW and the postal workers. And we knew that. So having met Gendon in the CAW, we know we were to meet Bickerton in CUPW. So it was kind of a logical process. And I can't remember the first trip to Ottawa for myself, responsible for the education work. But I do remember the first trip we made to Ottawa for a major meeting with South African trade unionist Zola Zembe with Jean-Claude Perrault. It was in your office on Metcalf. And the reason I remember it is because, you correct me if I get this wrong, but Jean-Claude was in negotiations or in discussions with Canada Post management. He actually exited himself from those meetings to meet Zola, which was to us an incredible move. I mean, Zola appreciated that beyond words. He said, this is someone you must follow. This is some union that you must work within. And we did. So that was our first actual contact between a SAC2 leader and postal worker leader. So I remember that very clearly. I also remember an occasion which amazed everyone, including myself and Zola. Zola was on tour in 1981 and again in 83, I believe it was, in Canada. And at one point along the way, we were invited to join the postal workers who had decided they were going to have a major event on May Day, a march or at one of the hotels in Ottawa. So we were invited to speak. And so, of course, Zola was going to be the speaker, not me. And on that agenda were other very progressive people to speak. And the problem was the postal workers had also opened the bar too early in that hotel. So people had started to drink and they're having a good time and they were getting noisy. So Jean-Claude could not be heard when he tried to speak. Al Campbell from London, who was also a very progressive union leader, he couldn't speak. Nobody was listening. And I forget, there was another speaker. Nobody was listening. So Zola was then called upon to speak. So Zola, being Zola, said, he's standing at the microphone. He said, I will not speak, and nobody could hear him. He repeated that over and over again. I will not speak. I will not speak. Eventually, he got the rest of the sentence, until you listen. For whatever reason, there was a lull in the noise, and people started to listen. And Zola gave his usual dynamic speech. That's one of those memorable occasions, not just with the postal workers, but in our entire 8 years of work. It was one of those things where a South African had to grab the reins and bring it to where you wanted to be. And he did it very effectively. So once this relationship was established, then we were being invited to regional programs, schools, of CUPW across the country. And the support was absolutely fantastic. And at some point, I have to almost say it was because of people like yourself and Gendon and the union that we were able to establish the roots of our work. Without that, without the progressive leadership, then, I'm not sure that we would have been as successful as we were. But those are some of my early memories of our work with CUPW. And of course, in Toronto, after we had a problem with the fire in our first location, the local in Toronto, which was just up the street, invited us to take up space in their union building, which was an incredible way to further establish a relationship between ourselves and the CUPW. And that proved to be a very, very important development for us. So those are some of my, go ahead, Jeff.
Ken, You mentioned the fire in your previous location. Was that on Cecil Street?
I'm sorry?
Was your previous location where there was a fire, was that on Cecil Street?
No, it was on at the corner of Broadview and Danforth.
Okay.
It was a block away from your local office. And the landlord, it was a kind of an old rundown building. I think the landlord may have had something to do with the fire, and we don't really know what happened, but we were then without a space to work. And we were only a few months old by that time. And so within a year of our existence, we had to find a location. And through your office up in Ottawa, we were somehow approached to have space in the CUPW local in Toronto, which we greatly appreciated and which we grabbed immediately. So that was what I remember.
Was there anything memorable? I know this is a digression, but it's just something that's always been, I've been thinking of lately, because it was mentioned in our last session about the fire, that a fire led you to go to our place. You wouldn't happen to remember when that fire was, would you? Like the
one that forced us out of our building?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That was early on, 1981 at the latest. It might even been in late 80.
And it wouldn't have been on Labor Day, would it?
No, I don't. Well, I don't remember. It might have been, because I know Brenda and I were out of town. So maybe it was a holiday weekend, and we were called by another young woman who was helping us in the office, saying that we've managed to save your books, but we haven't saved anything else. So it was one of those situations.
The only reason I'm asking is, the Communist Party building on Cecil Street had a fire.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was on Labor Day. And I think it was 80 or 81. Anyway, at the very same moment that they had a fire, we had a fire in our office, and it was arson. People broke in, they tried to set fire to several of the offices. They were successful with one. There was actually people in the restaurant downstairs at the time. So it was really dangerous to do that. Anyway, and then we had to relocate for several months. But it's always, it's never failed to take my attention that these two fires were actually going on at the very same moment on Labor Day in two organizations.
Yes.
Just wondering if there was a third organization.
No, I don't think so. It was. I mean, it may have been in the same year, but it wasn't in the same.
Yeah.
But, yeah. So, but there were a lot of things that we came to the CUPW to ask for. I mean, one of our specific campaigns given to us by SACTU was called Voices in Solidarity, where we had asked union leaders in Canada to make a cassette tape recording, a comment in solidarity, which would then be sent to South Africa through the underground and played at railway stations where, hundreds and thousands of workers, Black workers, would mass before going back to the townships. So, Zola explained this to us and explained it to Jean-Claude. This is the way it works. You tape the tape recorder onto a pole at the railway station. Somebody pushes the button, and all of a sudden, Jean-Claude is saying solidarity messages to South African workers without having to go to South Africa, without having to endanger anybody's lives. Bob White, Jean-Claude Perrault, and other progressive leaders were willing immediately to jump for that opportunity to do as we had asked about those tape recordings. The ironic thing is that even Dennis McDermott, once Bob White did it, Dennis McDermott wanted to do it. But only after Bob White did it. Otherwise, McDermott would have played the ICFTU, we don't deal with SACTU card. So that's an example, again, of CUPW responding quickly. Then we get into the sanctions movements, which we had developed by mid-80s, based largely on the research of Ken Trainer and the publication that we put out, Trafficking and Apartheid. So we were called upon as part of the international work around South Africa to have sanctions at the workplace, not just in the streets, but in the workplaces, where workers would be called upon to refuse to participate or have anything to do with a connection that had anything to do with South Africa. So our targets were reservation agents in the airline sector, that was CAW. postal workers, CUPW, telephone workers, CWC and the TWU in BC, and also dock workers, of course, on the ships in Vancouver. So we had a week of action in the, I think 1986, I believe it is, and we called upon workers to do those things. And so postal workers were encouraged by their leadership to refuse to handle any mail to or from South Africa, and similarly for the other sectors. And that worked very successfully, and nobody got fired, nobody was punished, nobody was disciplined, because by that time, the movement against South Africa was so well established in the consciousness of people. After only 6 years, in 1980, we weren't talking about sanctions. By 86, we were seeing workers take action. Even in the Don jail in Toronto, O'Brien Hyman got inmates to refuse to eat South African peaches.
Do you remember the incident that happened outside the embassy here in Ottawa on that day?
Go ahead, remind me.
Okay, so there was so we decided that, and it wasn't just CUPW members, but it was Jean-Claude and a bunch of people some of the people from our local and our national. We had worked with the letter carriers to make sure that that the letter carrier would not deliver mail that day to the South African embassy. And the letter carrier concerned him with it. He was a decent guy, but he was not necessarily political, etc. So he said, yeah, he was okay with that. He was going to do it. But then, of course, it became sort of publicly known in the post office that we were going to do that this day. We were going to no one was supposed to move any mail destined to South Africa or coming from South Africa. So he decided to book off sick that day. And we ended up with a relief letter carrier who was much more tuned into the local and said, absolutely, no problem. He's not delivering, he doesn't care. And you're right, management didn't try anything with him. So we went down to the embassy to picket on that day, to make sure that nobody else is going into the embassy. And and there was a news crew there from either CBC or CTV, one of the news crews, and Jean-Claude is there with some of the others. And this, I don't know what it was. It was a courier. It could have been a Federal Express truck, or it could have been another private courier, but drove up and was going to make a delivery. So the camera comes right in. Jean-Claude goes and talks to the driver, and the camera goes right in to hear this conversation, right? Like they're listening to it. And Jean-Claude explains what the day was, what we were doing, why we were doing it. And the driver just looks at him and says, well, I'm not going in there then, and drives off. And so that was on I don't know if it was on the national news, but it was certainly on our local news that they did a story about this day. And they actually, they showed that, and they showed the driver driving away, just saying no. So it was, but it was like those moments, right, where if you don't do it, if you don't take a little bit of risk, that driver is not going to just go through and say something and then make the delivery anyway, and they'll say the day was a failure. But you gotta do something, or it doesn't happen.
Thank you for that story. That's important to have on tape.
Yes, excellent story.
If Jane Armstrong were on the call, she would at that point ask you, as I'm going to ask you, is there any possibility of finding that clip? Is it something that would have been archived with CUPW materials, or how would we go about getting that from local TV?
If you can give me the date that happened, I can look back through old news clippings. We have a pretty good record at that time, and then we could perhaps contact either the CTV or CBC to see if they would actually have it once we have the date.
Yeah, okay. We certainly know the week of action, and that's well documented. Okay. And that then is a spin-off to the broader question: do CAW archives exist, and if so, would there be access to them by this project so that we could find additional materials to what we've gathered ourselves?
So right now we actually have 3 people that are from a sort of a private outfit actually working on our archives, because we have so much that's not digitized, and
Right.
most of this would fall in that category.
Right.
So what I can do is I can ask our secretary treasurer if she can ask them to take any references to South Africa, to Sactu Solidarity, etc.
Yeah.
And I think they actually are putting this all together. They've totally captured our downstairs boardroom, and they're working every day on this. So
Good.
so there's probably never a better time to be able to put this together, because our files are pretty crummy, let's face it.
Would that include local union newspapers, local union materials?
Yeah, it would.
Good.
Oh,
Perfect.
wow, what a treasure trove. That would be wonderful if you could do that.
Yeah, that'd be
Yeah.
great. And we've been able to collect all of our newsletters, all the lists of the strike fund donors. We've got a lot, and it's been archived. The first dump of materials was last fall. We're planning to do that again this fall. So any new materials that we can pull together by the end of the year would be great.
Okay, so I'll write our secretary treasurer, and so basically we're looking at the period from. Are we looking at from 1980 to
88, 87, late 87. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll ask her for anything between 1980 and 1988.
Well,
Exactly.
I'm sorry, but I think there were also, because of the work of the Sactu Solidarity Committee, there was a lot of follow-up through that period, 1990 to 94 as well.
Okay,
I think that's still useful fodder for the Library and Archives Canada. If you could make it that larger, post the
Sure.
Sactu Solidarity Committee as well.
Because what we're finding, Jeff, and this will not surprise you, is that the story of anti-apartheid work in Canada is told differently than what happened. You know, people like Mulroney get credit for things he never did. And, you know, the labor movement, as Jane would point out right now, she's done a lot of research on this. The labor movement is seldom mentioned. And when it is, the work that we did is virtually ignored, either because people don't have access to it or they don't think that workers are important to the story. So that's why we're doing this. And it's very important.
Geoff, amazing stuff. But just to bring us back to the story again of Sactu Solidarity and CUPW, any last reflections before we sort of say goodbye to each other?
The work of Sactu transformed the thinking of the CUPW leadership around solidarity work. And so there, you know, when we talk about, as you mentioned, the spin-offs into the 1990s, it wasn't just around, it wasn't limited to South African work. It was work that led, you know, Jean-Claude going to Chile on an Oxfam group, a tour or whatever, during the regime, during the dictatorship, which was a little bit risky, I must admit. Some of us were a little bit worried. It led to us eventually negotiating a fund for international solidarity work that we now have. I think it transformed the thinking of the union in many ways, in terms of understanding the responsibility of unions beyond their own members, you know, beyond the immediate workplace situations of our membership, which of course, you know, this is where the vast majority of the union's work and energy lies, and that's totally appropriate, and that's right. But to not understand our responsibilities for our members, on behalf of our members, to deal with issues around broader society, social justice, the environment, and the situation in other countries, is a big mistake. And we have been the recipients of a lot of support from workers in other countries. We have been a recipient. If you look at our collective agreement around health and safety issues, there are many clauses that are in our collective agreements that are there because other unions in other countries operating the same type of postal equipment that we operate achieve things that we hadn't even thought of, like having 5-minute breaks every hour for people working on coding machines, like having lower noise levels, like having rotation of duties in every section so that people aren't doing all, some people aren't doing all the heavy work, etc. These are all things that we picked up, having more time off for night workers. These are things that we picked up from our contacts with other unions that transmitted, not to changing Canadian society, but make a daily difference to the members that we have working in our plants and delivering the mail. So, so this has not been a one-way street.
And we interviewed Jim Sinclair last week, and he talked about the importance of JC's trip to Chile in terms of developing Latin American solidarity work within the labor movement. And so that's a very good case in point. And I remember after the SAC2 work, I worked, for the CUPW International Department, and we worked closely with Everett Hoogers around the question of Colombia. And we've interviewed Everett as well. So there's a lot of feedback and outgrowth out of the work we did globally. Now, I have one final question before we wrap it up. We've noticed, those of us who are doing this project, that most of our interviewees are from Central or Western Canada. We're a little bit sparse in terms of interviewees from Atlantic Canada. Now, I'm trying to remember who the activists would have been in locals in Halifax, in New Brunswick, elsewhere in CUPW. I think this is before Daryl Tingley's rise to prominence.
No, well, Daryl was on the National Executive Board by that time. He gets elected in 77, but becomes a much more of a leader beginning in the 80s. And Wayne Mundo did a tremendous amount of international work. He went to Trinidad and Tobago.
Absolutely.
He worked a lot with them. Wayne is would be a really, and gee, I'm trying to think of, there's a sister now whose name will come to me and I'll send it to you, who also did a lot of work. There's a lot of work done by people in the Atlantic around Cuba and Cuba Solidarity. Fred Furlong is another,
Yes.
It was another carrier involved.
Thank you. Yeah, I had forgotten Wayne Mundo. That's obviously the person we should make contact with. Yeah.
Ruth Larson was the name of the person I'm thinking of. Ruth
Okay,
Larson.
yes.
And so she would have been involved at that time at the local level. And I would very much think that she would have had dealings with SAC2 at that time.
Yes, and Cuba was her main focus, correct?
Became her main focus, but I don't know when, when exactly that happened.
Okay.
See, I think the work with SAC2 unlocked a lot of people's thinking about a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, Furlong I met again in the Port Elgin context, as he became a very important person to your education program at Port Elgin. Well, this is great. I mean, it's worth doing this to remind ourselves of where we came from.
Yeah. Yeah.
For me, it's been exciting to hear all these stories and see a picture that just hasn't really been told. And I think out of this, the fruits out of this labor will help rewrite an unknown part of the Canadian history there. So I'm really, really excited by this.
Doug, why don't you explain to Geoff what you're doing is the bigger picture?
Well, it came out of our involvement in Amandla Radio. I've been doing that since '97, and the founder of the radio show started it in '87 when she was an activist at McGill University in the Anti-Apartheid Committee. And in 2013, when Mandela died, a certain Stephen Harper was in charge here in Canada, and he loaded up a plane load of folks from Ottawa and related territory, bureaucrats and politicians, etc., to fly down to Mandela's funeral and proclaim how much Canada had done for the liberation of Southern Africa and freedom for Mandela. And of course, we were absolutely outraged at this egregious writing of history. rewriting of history, because what you have just told is the kind of struggles we went through to have an influence of any sort over that policy. And so at that point, we set up a radio show to counteract or counter the propaganda that was coming out via the Conservative Party, and interviewed a bunch, maybe about 10 activists in Quebec and 10 across country, including, I believe, at least one or two of the SACTU Solidarity Committee people. And it was a wonderful show, a wonderful quilt that showed that this is a big country and things are handled differently, but that, you know, there was something going on, and it was all against what were you doing to help Canada or to promote Canada to be more progressive in its outlook towards apartheid, and what did Mandela mean to you? In fact, what was the Canadian government's response? And so it was just a beautiful, beautiful show. We almost won. We were nominated for a radio award at that time. It took us a few years to get organized, and now it's really taken off since the SACTU guys, as they were effective with the unions. They've been effective with me, getting me mobilized to do all of these things. We're up to almost 25 trade unionist interviews now. And the rest of my project is still outstanding, but we're going to do Quebec. We're going to do all the rest. With that, I think I'll thank you, Geoff Bickerton.
Great.
It's been a great interview, wonderful analysis. Great to meet you again after many, many years. And greetings to Jane rather. We knew each other when I was a CUPW member a long time ago. Actually, I was president of my local, so more than a member. And thank you for that. And Ken, thanks again. So I wish you a good day. I'm going to turn the recording off first.